November 9th of 1913 was the most disastrous storm of all. When you think of that, in 350 years of recorded history, this was the storm that did the most damage. It was actually 3 separate storms. If you remember Sandy from 2012, it came up from the Atlantic coast. It got as far as the Great Lakes and then it kind of started losing power. Well, in 1913, the storm that came up from the Atlantic coast met another storm that was coming from the Great Plains. And they both collided over lower Lake Huron. And there was a third system that no one really understood until just recently. They didn't know anything about upper atmospheric disturbances, but this third system took those two that merged together and made it into just, before the term was created, a perfect storm. It just generated winds and blizzard conditions that were unprecedented. Along the shoreline, cities like Port Huron, from Cleveland up to Port Huron, came to a standstill. The streetcars stopped running. It was blizzard condition. People were dealing with snow that was measured in feet, not in inches. In some cases, the railroads stopped running, and the telegraph and telephone lines were down. They were the first to go. But as bad as it was along the shoreline, in the center of Lake Huron, it was just unbelievable hell. Because between the hours of 8 o'clock and midnight on November 9th, 9 ships disappeared on lower Lake Huron. There were 250 casualties, 250 sailors, men and women, that made their lives on the lakes, lost their lives. Of course, none of this was known at the time. The telegraph and telephone lines were down. The ships had just vanished. No one knew that actually what happened until the bodies started washing ashore. And along the Canadian shoreline, 200 bodies washed ashore over a period of a couple of days. But probably the most shocking sight, because no one had ever seen anything like this before. Did you advance to the next slide? An upside-down freighter was found floating 9 miles north of Port Huron.
How long was that ship?
Well, we'll get to that.
We'll get to that. Sorry, Bob. Okay. I won't ask.
No, part of the reasoning is because nobody could identify it. They knew at that, they didn't even know at that time that 9 ships were gone. This was the only indication, other than the bodies that washed ashore, that something had gone terribly wrong. Now, all the experts began to weigh in. They tried to measure it, they measured the width, they tried to speculate what the length would be. Of course, they were all wrong. The newspapers picked up on it immediately, called it the mystery ship. And this received nationwide coverage for a good week. Go to the next one. So with no one knowing what their family, loved ones were on, they were desperate to know what the name of this ship was. And of course, the name would be 25 feet below the surface. There was no way anybody could see it. So finally, the president of the Lake Carriers Association, William Livingston, put up $100 of his own money as a reward for anybody that could find the name of the ship. A quick Google search shows that $100 is now between $2,500 and $3,000 in buying power.
Wow.
So it wasn't an insignificant sum. So a diver from Detroit, his name was William Baker, said that if they would provide transportation out to the wreck, that he would identify the ship. So we come to the next slide. So on the morning of November 15th, the lake had finally calmed down enough where the tug Sport, which has a whole story behind it too, was able to get out to the wreck. They found where it was floating, and he just started to prepare for the dive. Now this was an extremely dangerous dive because normally he would be lowered down at a platform. But in this case, they lashed a ladder to the stern of the tug, and he climbed down and jumped off into space, basically. Just, having all this, trusting his crew that were providing his air and his guidance. He worked his way down to the hull and finally found 25 below the surface where the name was painted. He traced it with his hands twice because you have to remember it was upside down. And he wasn't quite sure where he was. But he knew enough to go forward to see if there was any collision damage, because there had been talk that it possibly had collided with another ship. He didn't find any collision damage, so he signaled to be brought up onto the tug. But this time there were several reporters and waiting, and when they got him on the tug and they took his face mask off, and they were just so anxious to know what the name of the tug was, I mean the name of the boat, and he said, "Pay me my $100 first." Those are the words that will live in Great Lakes history. So he was assured that he would get his money. So he told him, "It's one of the big boys." He said, "It's the Price. It's the Charles S. Price." And that sent shockwaves through the maritime community because she was only a couple of years old and 500 feet long. She was one of the biggest ships that they had built up to that point. So once they realized they had the name of it, the interest went away almost as quickly as it came. The Price was allowed to sink. Again, that'll be the second time. Gone forever, as far as anybody knew. But that wasn't the case, because if we fast forward to the next slide.
These are your paintings?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, good.
In 1917, the First World War was raging in Europe. Anything that would float was worth a fortune. The Great Lakes Towing Company, still in existence in Cleveland, had just built this big salvage tug called the Favorite. And they began thinking of all these almost new freighters, 9 of them, that were lying on the bottom of Lake Huron. The trouble is, they only knew where one of them was. So they decided they would pull an all-out effort to salvage the tug, or to salvage the Price. And of course, that meant they had to raise it from the bottom. So they started a process with divers going down and sealing all the holes that they could get to, and making other openings that they could attach air lines to start pumping air into this overturned hull. Now the Favorite was just perfectly built for this. It had 2 giant compressors. It could house 200 people, so it had a huge crew on it. And they worked for 2 days, and they finally began filling it with air, and they got the bow to the surface again. Now, while this was going on, other divers, you can see them being lowered on platforms here, were going down, and when they started to examine the rest of the hull, as it came out of the muck at the bottom, they realized that it was squashed flat. It was like you took a tube of toothpaste and squashed it flat. The whole stern was completely smashed, and of course, with the all-important engines in it. So they went back and they reported this, and they realized that all the money they had spent so far had been wasted, and that they shouldn't waste any more time or any money trying to raise the rest of it. They just let it sink again. So that's the Price was raised 3 times actually, if you count it, and it's sunk 3 times. So that was the end of the salvage of the Price, but it still didn't answer the question, what had happened to all those other ships? Why did it have so much damage on the stern? Of course, you have to remember, they didn't know where any of the other ships were. It wasn't until the late 70s and early 80s that they began to find these other ships. So I put together this program that traces the story of the Hanna, and it also answers some of the questions about what happened to those other ships. So now is the tricky part. We can say,
You want to do that?
you just have to just one hit inside.
There it is. There we go. And the wires on that.
Just at the very northern tip of the thumb, there's an area, it's a beautiful stretch of shoreline. It's called Alaska Bay. But it's deceiving because under these waters are the bones of dozens of wooden ships. This was a death trap during the wooden ship era. It got so bad that finally the government went ahead and built a lighthouse that they started building in the 1870s, the Port Austin Reef Light. But it sits on a reef that goes out 2 miles into the lake. Now, this lighthouse is undergoing a real restoration today, this year especially. But this whole area, it's like somewhere in time. It's like time has stopped. The lighthouse keeper's dwelling still stands facing the shoreline. You can see the results of dozens of storms, the erosion on the bluffs around the shore. There's even a capstan that still stands on the shoreline. This was used by the life-saving service to raise and lower their boats. And then right behind that is a restored life-saving station. These are some of the rarest buildings in the country. There's only 5 of these early Coast Guard buildings still in existence. But in a cottage on one of the bluffs, there's a life ring over the fireplace, which isn't unusual. A lot of people have nautical themed decoration there, but when you see the life ring and you see the flag for the W.C. Richardson Company, a long gone Great Lakes fleet, and you see the name that's painted on the life ring, Howard M. Hanna Jr., you realize this is a direct link to something that happened here 110 years ago. That was the sinking of the Howard M. Hanna. Now the Hanna herself was a pretty imposing ship for her time. Okay. What's happening?
Oh, it's going.
Oh, there's
It's going. There we go.
This is the Hanna. She was 500 feet long. She was a result of almost a half a century of evolution in the development of Great Lakes ships. She was steered, obviously, from the bow, and the deck crew lived in the bow. In the stern was the engines and the boiler, and what we would call the catering crew, those that took care of the rest of the crew. And this left an almost unbroken 300-foot-long hull that was perfect for carrying bulk commodities like iron ore, coal, wheat, and limestone. She was very efficient in what she did. Her whole design was driven by the unloading equipment on shore. The Hanna was built at a time when all the fleets were replacing their old wooden ships with these huge steel freighters. And the Hanna had one other innovation. She was built with a new system called the Isherwood girder system. You can see these huge girders across the top. This was important because it allowed these huge unloading machines called Hewlett unloaders to get down into the hull unimpeded. But now, before that, with the older style of ship, they had a pillar and post system that really hindered those Hewletts from doing their work. So this was really a step forward, and plus it made for a really rigid and strong hull too. Now these Hewletts were just brutally efficient. They were guided by a man, an operator in a cab. You could just barely see it. They took this big clamshell down into the hole and he spun it around and scooped out the iron ore. Now, in doing this, he had to be extremely careful because he could easily damage the hatch combings. And because of this, the hatch combings were lower to the surface of the deck than on most ships. They were between 12 and 14 inches high. Now this was crucial because for waterproofing, these hatches had to be covered with the hatch covers again, and then these tarps stretched over them. And that's what actually made them waterproof. So looking at a picture like this, you can tell a lot. For one thing, it's late in the season. They were having to put the tarps over the covers again. But this was the state of the art. Hanna was probably one of the finest ships built at that time. She was built in Cleveland in 1908. But they did have some intrinsic faults. And one was she was underpowered. She had a 1,600 horsepower engine. An ocean-going ship with the same tonnage would have a 2,400 horsepower engine. This meant that there was no margin. When they would run into difficult conditions, they couldn't rely on getting extra power from the engine. It would be up to the skill of the captain to get them out of any sort of jam they were in. I just found out recently that triple chime whistle was still in existence. So underpowered and with hatch combings that should have been 3 feet high, but they're only 14 inches high. Nevertheless, this was the end of the season. They were beginning to stockpile coal in the far reaches of Lake Superior. So the Hanna was ordered to make this one last trip of the year. It was getting close to the end of the season. If she had completed this trip, she would have gone all the way up and all the way across into Lake Superior. So with her orders in hand, she showed up at Lorain, Ohio on the morning of November 5th, where she was to pick up a load of coal. Now, Lorain, Ohio was a very congested harbor, and this was long before there were bow thrusters or any sort of maneuverability built into the ships. It depended on tugs to move them around. She was placed under the coal docks, and she took on 9,150 tons of coal from the Upper Peninsula. Then when this coal was all loaded and trimmed, you can see the hatch covers folded on the sides. She was then moved over to a replenishment dock, where she took on 350 tons of coal for fuel. Now, Captain Hagen was a 25-year-old veteran, 25-year sailing. He wanted to make sure that the ship was victualized and supplied for a 10-day round trip. With any luck, they would be back by Thanksgiving and everyone would be paid off for the season. So they were maneuvered out of the harbor again by the tugs. And this is when Captain Hagen began writing in his log, which makes extremely interesting reading. He noted for the first time that the storm flags were flying at the lighthouse at the mouth of the harbor. Now this was November. Sometimes the storm warning flags flew the whole month. Nevertheless, as they sailed across Lake Erie, they joined a procession of other ships that were all loaded with coal, heading up to Lake Superior. Winter protocol was followed. They put covers over the hatches, they put extra battens on the hatches, the lifeboats were double chocked in place, and in some cases they even put storm shutters on the windows. Now this has never been seen before. These are out of the Taylor family album. And the neat thing about these pictures of the Hanna is they're dated on the back, August 17th, 1913. So just 2 months before the November storm. You can see that flag that was painted on the life ring. These are a remarkable series of photographs where I was given access to in the family album. Now, on board, part of the deck crew was made. These are 4 of the deck crew. The fellow in the center with a dark sweater on, his name was Guy Taylor. He was a 21-year-old second mate on the Hanna. And why they're looking at that particular sign, have sheepish grins, there's probably a story behind it. It gives you some idea of the age, how youthful the deck crew were. He's probably a mate on the left smoking the pipe. And probably had something to do with their behavior. They had one more stop on their way through the Detroit River. And then, as today, the Westcott Company was still in business, but it was even more important then because it was a marine reporting service, which meant they were able to get mail for the crew. But they were able to get the latest bulletins from the weather department, and they were able to get letters from their company to see if there was any change in orders. Now, the storm flags had been flying. Captain Hagen thought maybe there were changes in their orders, but nothing was forthcoming. This is a job that had to require nerves of steel. Can you imagine rowing out next to a freighter in a rowboat and having a line tossed to you? I mean, it's just incredible what they did. But for now, it was routine as usual, shipboard routine. She headed on her way up the Detroit River. Watches came on, watches came off, meals were served. But I'm sure the crew that were on duty couldn't help but notice every government installation, that's the old Belle Isle Lighthouse on the left, every government installation still had the storm warning flags flying. But without any change in orders, they continued across Lake St. Clair, where we had a St. Clair lightship. Sailed up the St. Clair River, and it was deceivingly warm. It was almost like an August day. And when you see the names of some of these ships, this is the Scott, the Isaac M. Scott. This is the McGeehan. Now, all these ships were fully manned. None of them knew they were heading basically into eternity. Not one of these ships had a crew member that survived. This is the Argus. She was found upside down. This is a small Canadian package freighter called the Regina. It was busily calling at different ports. It had a 600 horsepower engine. It didn't have a chance. As they came up through, entered in, starting to get into Port Huron, they did notice that the river itself was strangely empty for this time of year. A lot of ships had dropped anchor, and they passed the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse, which in just a matter of hours would be almost toppled from its foundation. And their last link with the shore would have been the Port Huron lightship, or as it was known, the Corsica Shoals lightship. It was blown completely off its station over to the Canadian side, and And that in itself resulted in a scandal that if we had time afterwards I can mention. But she was blown off her station, and as she headed out into the Lake Huron, Captain Hagen noted that for the first time he noticed that the barometer was beginning to fall. Now, there was a saying in this day amongst lake captains that the best way to deal with a falling barometer was to hang your hat over it. This is one storm that couldn't be ignored. As we spoke before, all three systems had merged over lower Lake Huron. It was beginning to drift south, and all these ships carrying coal were beginning to head directly into it. Of course, there was no communication between ships. No ship could tell another what was going on. Harbor Beach, the harbor itself was beginning to fill up with the smaller wooden ships. There was not one smaller wooden ship lost on Lake Huron. And it was just north of Harbor Beach that they began running into the heavy winds. Totally unexpected to the degree that they were. In fact, the highest winds in the storm were recorded off Harbor Beach at 91 miles an hour. The first ship to go down, as far as we know, was the Isaac M. Scott. It was found in the late 70s, upside down, with its cargo of coal scattered around it. Now, these were all big ships. They wouldn't be out of place today if you saw one. The Regina, that small Canadian package freighter, made it actually as far north as the tip of the thumb, where she finally gave up and tried to turn around and made it all the way back down to Port Sanilac, where she finally sank, and she's now lying upside down. This is the Argus that was found upside down just a few miles from her downbound sister ship, the Hydrus. Both of them sank during the storm. And like I mentioned before, all the crews from these ships were lost. So we had no eyewitness accounts of what actually happened. This is the McGee, and she was found off Harbor Beach upside down. And all these ships sank between the hours of 8 and midnight on November 9th. This is the Price, the one that we saw floating upside down originally. And the Toa was a strange case. This deserves a story in itself. She was the oldest ship to go down, but she didn't actually sink. She was driven ashore and broke apart on the shoreline just above Harbor Beach. Now it was the Hanna's turn. She was steaming north. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Captain Hagen noted in his log that he was really becoming concerned. In fact, it's amazing they made it that far in the kind of conditions they were sailing. They left Harbor Beach at noon, and it took them until 5 o'clock to get to Point of Arcs. And it was there that they began to encounter the first of the really heavy seas. Now, these winds coming down the whole length of Lake Huron were generating waves that were 25 to 30 feet high. He wrote in his log that he didn't know how long something man-made could take this kind of punishment. But it's a tribute to the old shipbuilders. It really did survive to this point. And what they didn't realize is the real damage was being done as these waves crashed around the bow of the ship and began running the whole length of the hull, all 300 feet of that unobstructed hull. They were beginning to tear the tarps off the hatch covers. This was beginning to allow hundreds of gallons of water to seep into the ship, making it ride lower and heavier to control. Now, this kept up until 5:30 in the afternoon, when Captain Hagen really began to get worried, and he was constantly reining in the engine room to make sure they were having enough power to head into the seas, because he didn't want too much power because the bow would be driven headfirst into the waves. He wanted just enough power to keep them buoyant, to keep them above the height of the waves. So he was constantly in touch with the engine room. But the ship was getting lower and riding more sluggish in the water all the time. And this was extremely dangerous, because if they lost headway, the ship would be turned lengthwise into what's called the troughs of the waves. And this is what happened to all those ships that sank. As they lost headway, the wind spun them around, and they ended up on their beam ends or on their sides, rolling back and forth. And with a cargo like coal that was constantly shifting and had water in it too, it really made the ship roll. In fact, Captain Hagen said that it was all they could do to hang on to anything in the wheelhouse to prevent from being blown out the windows, because the windows had been blown out by this time. He had no control over the ship. All he could do was ride it out and try to think of some way that they could possibly get out of this trough. Now, as bad as it was in the bow for them trying to hold on, can you imagine what it was like in the engine room? A ship lying on its side and these stokers trying to keep fire in the boilers. I don't know how they did it. Captain Hagen realized that he couldn't get any more power. It wouldn't do him any good. And he caught a quick glance of the Port Austin Reef light. And he realized how close they were to disaster. Because if they had hit the reef, it would have been all over right there. So he ordered both anchors dropped immediately to try to turn her head around. And it worked. Both the anchors managed to turn the bow around and get her out of the trough. But even with two 3,000-pound anchors out, probably as much weight as chain, and with the engines going full ahead, he was being blown backwards. This was unprecedented. No one had ever experienced anything like this before. But then one of those quirks of fate that enabled us to learn what actually happened. A series of waves began lifting the Hanna. And when they got almost alongside the reef, of course he didn't know this at the time, a wave lifted up the stern, and instead of slamming it into the side of the reef, it actually lifted them up and set them on the reef. And it was probably because he pivoted on the anchors and the anchor line that he had let out. So here they were sitting, 4 feet of water on the one side, 40 feet drop off. So they were perched on this very vulnerable part. In fact, the lighthouse was manned, but the keeper in the lighthouse didn't even know they were there. Can you imagine that? That gives you some idea of the noise and the turmoil of the waves. See how easy it is to make a painting out of a sketch? Those in the bow, they were relatively well off. They had built a fire in the guest room bathtub, and they were all huddling around it, thinking they were going to get into trouble for tearing the paneling off the walls and making a fire. In fact, the mate said that they were going to be held accountable for that. Those in the stern, it was a completely different story. They were actually submerged, and as the bow was just dealing with freezing spray, those in the stern were dealing with green water, immersing them, green water running in and out of the cabins that they were in. It was all they could do to find some place to climb up on, cupboards or cabinets, anything to stay out of that frigid water. They were the last 2 days on this reef just like this. And they were professional sailors. They probably remembered vividly the story of the Matafa, a ship almost identical to the Hanna. And a few years before, had gone aground in front of Duluth Harbor. The ship was completely encased in ice, and right in front of the harbor, in front of hundreds of people, everyone in the stern perished from exposure. All 9 in the stern died before they could get to them. So probably the people in the stern in the Hanna were thinking, is this going to be their fate? Is this what's going to happen to them? Now, because of the design of the ships, there was no way they could get back and forth. So those in the bow, even though they were slightly safer, they had nothing to eat. They had no food, nothing to eat or drink. Those in the stern were really basically submerged, and most of them were at the point of getting hypothermia, when the most unlikeliest of heroes stepped forward. This was 26-year-old Sadie Black. She was a second cook. She thought it was her responsibility to go down in her galley, even though it was flooded, and try to find something for them to eat. And she did this repeatedly, and brought them back cans, tins of fruit, anything that she could find that they could eat. And they all agreed later that it was due to her unselfish act that they survived at all. They did this until they begged her to stop, because her clothes were freezing around her. My wife says she's a petite size. She ended up wearing men's clothes. November 11th, it's Tuesday morning, the waves had somewhat abated. Guy Taylor was ordered to come back and see because the second mate's responsibility was the port lifeboat. And he was ordered to come back and report the condition of the port lifeboat. Well, he went into the stern. He had to chip his way into the stern. And when he saw the condition of the 9 crew members in the stern, he realized that they weren't going to last any more hours under this kind of punishment. He went back, asked for volunteers from the deck crew, and asked permission from the captain if he could launch the lifeboat and take them to shore. This is Guy Taylor again. And just how they did it is, it's hard to understand because everything was encased in ice, as we saw in that earlier picture. They had to chip the ice off the lifeboat before they could launch it. And then somehow they got the 9 injured crew members on board the lifeboat. It's pretty remarkable when he did it. And you consider he's 21 years old too. But somehow they were all safely in the lifeboat, and he started out the 2-mile journey through tremendous surf to get them back to shore. At first he said he thought he could deposit them on shore and then come back to get the rest of the crew that were in the bow. But after a few minutes of being under these conditions, he realized that they were going to be lucky if they made it to the shore at all. The only thing that encouraged them, the people from the nearby towns like Port Austin and Grindstone had built bonfires on the beach. They knew that if they could get to the beach, they would probably have blankets and warm clothes for them to wear. But still, rowing in a damaged lifeboat with that many people in the boat, it's hard to believe how he did it for 2 miles. But he was successful, and in a remarkable feat of seamanship, he guided the boat back to the beach where they were all safely deposited.
How many oars would they have had in the water?
I'm assuming it was 4. They probably had more, but they probably couldn't get them. Now, what he didn't know was the life-saving station. If you remember at the beginning, we saw that early Coast Guard station. Their boathouse had been destroyed by the storm, and it had buried their surf boat. But they didn't know that while they were going on, while he was trying to make it to shore, the life-saving service crew were trying to get their boat repaired. And this is in blizzard condition, not like it shows in this picture here. This is just the same crew from 1913. So under the guidance of Henry Gill, one of the legendary keepers from the life-saving service, they managed to patch the surf boat together, and they donned their foul weather gear and began to row through the surf this time, back out 2 miles offshore to where the Hanna was. They not only did this once, they did it twice, until they had safely removed all the crew from the forward end of the ship. And this is a real tribute to the old life-saving service and what they were capable of doing. Some accounts said it took them 2 hours to row out to the boat in this freezing blizzard-like conditions. So everyone was safe now on shore. Hanna herself, though, now became a liability. This is a really interesting picture. It shows actually how close she came to hitting the lighthouse. And yet the lighthouse keeper didn't even know they were there until the following morning. Of course, when the newspapers realized that there was one crew that survived the storm, they began giving them all sorts of interviews and all sorts of press. And when they picked up the story of Sadie Black, they were just amazed that someone her size could do something like this when the rest of the crew were cowering up trying to stay out of the water. She willingly, and by the way, one of the crew was her husband. She willingly went repeatedly down, and this is her galley, where she says her whole world was turned upside down. And this is just some of the rooms on board the ship. This must have been a cruise room. I see a mattress there. The ship itself, from the exterior, the deck houses, the stack was off to one side. It was just pulverized. But most of the damage was in the stern that had been lowest in the water. So now the insurance company paid off the owners. And now they were stuck with this 500-foot-long ship that they were responsible for. So they began taking bids for salvage. This is an interesting photograph because you could see the break in the hull that occurred after they were put on the reef. The Reed Wrecking Company from Port Huron and Sarnia came out and looked at the ship. Captain Reed was in charge of the company, And when he examined the ship from head to stern, he realized that the bow was almost intact. But the stern that had received all the major damage, well, that belt still exists, by the way. He made an unusual move. After examining the ship from one end to the other, that Isherwood system had kept the hull completely intact. He made the unusual step of offering the insurance company $1,300 to buy the ship as is, where is. That's Captain Reed. The insurance company gladly took his offer. He now owns a ship full of 9,000 tons of coal. He used his own lighters to take the cargo of coal out, sold the cargo of coal for $10,000. Used his own equipment to patch the ship together, to get it in a floating condition, brought it back to Collingwood Shipyard, where he sold it to the Playfair interest, Canada Steamship Lines, for $100,000 the next year. So if there were any winners in this whole situation, it was Captain Reed. But then the Canada Steamship Line got an almost new ship. World War I was starting. It went on to make just money for its owners. It went through many names. This is it as the Goddard. It ended up as the Lionel Parsons in Goderich Harbor, and I actually walked on its deck when I was a teenager without knowing the story behind it. I just thought it was another old ship. Guy Taylor, the hero of the Port Lifeboat, went on to be a captain on the Great Lakes. This is him with his wife. He's wearing the traditional bow tie that all skippers seem to wear in the 20s and 30s. He died on board one of his own ships at the age of 43. A sailor right at the end of his life. Sadie Black, in spite of what she went through, continued sailing. She and her husband sailed together for another 20 years. Even though every year she said she was never going to sail again. They survived and they're both buried now in Toledo. And now the lighthouse still stands. Being beautifully restored again this year. The life-saving station still stands. The life ring still hangs over that fireplace in the cottage at Point of Arms. Hopefully it'll be there for generations more as a mute testimony as to what went on just offshore from where you were standing there. Yeah, well, I just want to bring up a couple of...
Oh, please do. Sorry.
Lawrence Taylor. He was the son of Guy Taylor, and he's the one that gave me access to all their family albums to get this material from. I finished the program in 2013. I wanted to show it to him. He died that year. He was 98. He went to his first Tiger baseball game. Some friends took him for his birthday, and he died in the restroom. That's a sad ending.
Good ending.
All right, questions for Bob? Thank you. Bob, please. Questions, and otherwise we're going to have Bob sign books in the back. The questions, sir. Go
The
ahead.
life-saving station is still,
Yes.
still go see, where is that?
It's in a private resort. It's called Point of Arms. But you can see it from the water. If you come in by boat or kayak, you can really see it.
So we're talking about the life-saving station. Yeah.
There's one other thing I wanted to mention about Sadie Black. When they got her to shore, she was almost done in. She had hypothermia. She couldn't stop shaking. They went to the railroad station at Grindstone City, which was just about a mile away. Hopefully you see the whole thing down
Go
there.
ahead. Yeah.
Anyway, they went
While
to
you're talking.
the railroad station and they telegraphed the company for money for a train ticket to send her to Port Huron. Well, there was no answer, probably because the lines were all down. So all these people on the beach, they passed the hat. And he raised enough money to buy her a train ticket, and when the trains were running again, she went to the hospital in Port Huron where she stayed for 2 weeks, recovering from hypothermia. That I only learned from talking to Lawrence Taylor, because this was passed down from his father. I've never seen that in a history book or anything written about that.
Other questions? Go ahead.
How did the journal survive? Did they bring it with them when they went ashore?
He wrote it. He wrote a copy of it. He sat down and he wrote from memory, page by page, what he had written. And there's one other very interesting, well, there's a couple of other interesting things that I learned by knowing that family. Guy Taylor, the one who went back to rescue the people in the stern, went back into the mess room where the crew ate. He had the presence of mind to go through the drawers until he found the napkin ring with his seat number on it. And he stuck it in his pocket. And when I met Lawrence Taylor, he said he still had it, and he didn't know what to do with it. So I got it, and it's now in the museum in Port Huron, in a case. And when you go and look at it, you just think of what's behind that napkin ring being in that showcase.
Okay, if there's no other question, Bob's going to go to the back and sign books, and I want to thank you all for coming. So sorry about the chair situation.